The Met, the country's top police force, is in crisis. Its reputation in tatters after being judged institutionally corrupt.
When you have corruption and you know you have it and you don't deal with it, you will allow corruption to develop within your organisation.
Attempts to get to the truth have been resisted for decades.
He said, no, you don't understand. If you start pulling at this string, you don't know where it will take you.
Tonight on Dispatches, evidence that the Met has still not faced up to the truth about police corruption.
The extent of what is revealed in those statements is deeply alarming.
Did top cops get too close to organised crime?
If that's true, that is outrageous. The relationship is too close, unacceptable, something that we as a police service should never be involved in.
The fear that corrupt cops allowed killers to walk free.
It's devastating, really, you know, because it would have been nice to have some sort of closure on my dad's murder.
During the course of the interviews we've had, you've implied on several occasions about a policeman that you believe to be corrupt.
I know he's corrupt.
Right? Now, what I want to do with you is for you to tell me exactly what you've witnessed, when, roughly, and why you think this person's corrupt.
In 1987, a criminal informant was recorded making serious allegations that senior Met police officers were corrupt. The tape has never been broadcast before.
Was there anything improper said to you, or any suggestions made regarding that job when you were arrested for that offence?
Yeah.
By those regional crime officers?
Oh, improper, oh yeah, but they wanted money from bail and all that.
He made many serious allegations, including that officers had taken money to keep criminals out of jail.
Lots of people in your position, when you're charged with a serious offence, will make...
Well, what's on about a load of... Well, I'm telling you now, this is not a load of... And this is on the head of my son.
Yeah, because you see, some people might say, well, it's easy for some...
Well, I'm not going to gain that, but I've pleaded guilty to what I'm here for.
Yeah.
So what am I gaining?
Yeah.
I ain't gaining nothing.
No, it's just a question that to be asked.
Yeah.
His claims sparked Operation Russell, the Met's most infamous corruption inquiry. One detective under suspicion killed himself. His suicide note said he'd been forced to inform on a CID police commander. Now, more than 30 years later, dispatchers can reveal just what the Met was trying to hide.
They were very concerned that there'd been an infiltration, and into the police by an organised criminal network. It would have meant that the people that we've taken an oath to catch actually knew we were going to do that before we did it, and that they would have been in front of us at all the times and influencing what we did.
Many officers faced corruption allegations, but the inquiry focused on the long association between two men. One was Commander Ray Adams, the Met's head of criminal intelligence. The other was a notorious gangster whose name the Met has never admitted to. He is Kenneth Noy. He would go on to kill 2 innocent men and rise to the top of organised crime in Britain.
Noy was a career criminal. As far as I'm concerned, it's in his DNA, and he would never change. He's a violent individual.
What Operation Russell discovered was alarming. Commander Adams had once helped Noy avoid prison after he'd been investigated for bribing a police officer. Noy avoided a jail sentence after Ray Adams told the judge that Noy was a current active informant. The report concluded, it is possible with hindsight to say the court, particularly the judge, was misled.
If there was even a suggestion that a judge somewhere hadn't got all of the information that a judge requires to make an honourable decision, then that needs to be looked at.
Potentially corrupt?
Well, if you've deliberately done it, it has to be. If you deliberately mislead a judge for a dishonest reason, well, I don't know another word you could call it, really.
Noy was not, as Adams had claimed, an active registered informant. Nonetheless, Operation Russell wrote, there is no evidence that suggests these actions were for corrupt motives by police, and in particular, Adams. Ray Adams also got involved when Noy was arrested on firearms offences. Again, Noy wasn't jailed. His criminality continued.
When thieves broke into the Brinksmat warehouse at Heathrow Airport in 1983, they were looking for cash. Instead, they found £26 million worth of gold. They brought in the master fence, Kenny Noy, to turn the gold into cash and real estate.
Noy was put under surveillance, but the operation went tragically wrong.
Two detectives dressed in camouflage kit watched the Noys home from a hideout in nearby woods owned by Anglican priests. At 6:15 in the evening, they were ordered to enter the grounds. 25 minutes later, one of the officers, Detective Constable Fordham, was found lying on the ground 8 yards from the gate, dying from 10 stab wounds.
Facing a life sentence for murdering a detective, Noy offered the senior investigating officer a £1 million bribe. He turned it down and reported it. Operation Russell said Noy then made much of his long association with Adams, telling detectives that Adams would say he was not a man of violence.
Well, using a senior police officer for such character evidence is totally out of order. The police have really got to look at themselves. If that's the state that we got into at that time and now, that is totally unacceptable.
Operation Russell was wound up in 1988 after concluding there was no evidence or insufficient evidence to substantiate any criminal charges. What Adams had done for Noy has been kept quiet by the Met ever since, even when Noy went on to kill again in 1996.
Stephen Cameron was stabbed at this roundabout on the M25 in what's been described as a road rage murder.
The high-profile investigation was led by Detective Superintendent Nick Biddis.
When I knew that it was Kenneth Noy who was the main suspect, I deliberately avoided, unless it was absolutely essential, involving any Metropolitan Police officers in any inquiries that we might have to do in the London area.
Noy was rumoured to be too close to some Met officers, but Nick Biddis didn't know Noy's police connections had once helped to keep him out of jail.
I had no idea about that report, or indeed the association that Noy may have had with officers in the Met.
What do you think now you've seen that report?
It's outrageous, absolutely outrageous. If that's true, that is outrageous. The relationship is too close, unacceptable, something that we as a police service should never be involved in.
Allegations that police officers had colluded with criminals stayed in the background. Those fears were reignited by the racist murder of 18-year-old Stephen Lawrence.
Well Hall Road in Elton. The exact location Stephen Lawrence was, in the words of one witness, swallowed up by a gang of white youths, forced to the ground and stabbed.
His family feared the murder suspects had been protected by corrupt police officers. One was the son of the gangster Clifford Norris, a known associate of Kenneth Noy.
Such is the emotion of this case, these men were never going to be able to leave quietly. One of the 5 men, David Norris, tried to retaliate.
We say there were officers within the police who interfered with the investigation, slowed it down, didn't arrest, didn't do searches, most importantly, did not develop information that they had within 24 hours. Why is that? Well, we say because the officers were protecting certain members of the fraternities.
Any evidence that the police might have protected criminals had the potential to be very important. In 1998, the family were trying to get to the truth at the McPherson inquiry. Ray Adams had been briefly involved in the murder investigation. He was cross-examined by Michael Mansfield. The Lawrence's barrister had been denied the chance to see the Russell report. This is the first time he's read it.
The core element of all this material demonstrates a form of collusion that we were arguing for. So when I was making submissions suggesting collusion, I didn't know there was a report capable of supporting that. What the report does show, without any question or dispute, that this very senior officer, Mr. Adams, had what was regarded as, in the report, as an improper relationship with a leading member of the fraternity who we would say would and could have had close connections with the criminal families at the core of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. I've never seen it before now, and personally I think we, the lawyers representing the Lawrence family, including the Lawrence family themselves, should have been able to have access to this.
The Operation Russell report was discussed in a private hearing between the Met and Lord McPherson's advisors. The inquiry ruled it was inadmissible.
First of all, I'd like to know, of the materials I've seen, how much of that material was seen by the relevant lawyers. Because sometimes you only get shown some sheets. How much of it was redacted? How much of it wasn't? Well, I don't know the answer to any of that.
The inquiry found there was no evidence that corruption had undermined the murder investigation. Ray Adams' representative told us that the corruption allegations against Adams had been investigated several times, and that he had been exonerated on every occasion. The McPherson inquiry had stopped a key report on police corruption being made public. DCI Clive Driscoll jailed 2 of Stephen Lawrence's killers. Almost 30 years on from their son's murder, the Lawrence family are still trying to get to the truth. In part 2, we reveal the secret files suggesting corrupt cops have kept killers out of jail.
It's devastating, really, you know, because it would have been nice to have some sort of closure on my dad's murder.
The Met's corruption files uncovered by dispatchers reveal serious concerns that corrupt officers were undermining a murder investigation. In September 1987, Sue Whitney's father vanished.
My dad was Kenneth Charles Whitney. He was a very chatty, friendly sort of person. As I was going out, I said to him, I'll see you, I'll probably see you at the weekend. And he said, all right, I'll see you then. And then he just disappeared the next day.
Kenneth's body was discovered 6 weeks later.
I was a detective sergeant at Heathrow. I was involved from the outset. He owned a Rover SD1. It had been reversed up against the crash barriers of the Terminal 3 car park. 2 people from the maintenance department were sent to deal with it. They found the car was locked. So one of them squeezed in between the crash barrier and managed to open the boot and was confronted straight away with the body.
My mum was watching the regional news and it came up that they'd found a Rover with the body in the boot, and she just said it clicked in her head, it must be Dad.
The detectives from Heathrow were sent to South London to investigate. The inquiry quickly established links to Joey Pyle, a local gangster who made his money from drug dealing and extortion.
You can compare him with the Crays or the Richardsons because he had he and his brother had their own gang, and they were feared. They were feared certainly throughout South London.
I believe he did know Joey Pyle because they was of the same age, and you know, obviously they'd crossed paths in the past and that.
There was a story going around that Whitney owed Pyle for drugs and that he hadn't paid. And this, we assumed, was the reason he died.
But Kenneth Whitney was also leading a double life as a police informant.
Every informant obviously takes a risk because if their colleagues find out, they're going to have no sympathy for that person.
Do you think he could have gone and killed?
Yes, very possibly.
Secret files seen by dispatches reveal that as the investigation progressed, allegations emerged that Pyle had a direct line to local police, with a detective chief superintendent described as Pyle's right-hand man.
That DCS, what sort of information would that role give him access to?
He's entitled to know everything.
And could that be sensitive information, potentially?
It would be. There would be a lot of sensitive information there.
One local officer warned the Heathrow murder squad that they should have had very little input from the local CID because corruption was rife in that office. It was also reported that officers were afraid to speak out. These officers fear physical reprisals against themselves and families if any overt action is taken against the CID. Senior detectives on the Heathrow murder team sent the reports to the anti-corruption squad working on the Operation Russell inquiry. Neither the DCS or any of the officers accused of being corrupt were interviewed. The allegations were dismissed as just gossip, rumor, myth, and innuendo. Detective King and the team from Heathrow hunted Kenneth Whitney's killers for 6 months before the case was closed.
He was giving us an update, but obviously he was getting nowhere because nobody was going to say anything. Thank you.
Dispatches showed Kenneth Whitney's daughter the report into police corruption surrounding her father's case. It's the first time she's seen it.
It's devastating, really, you know, because it would have been nice to have some sort of closure on my dad's murder. It's quite frightening that, you know, that this is quite high up in the police, that, you know, that goes on. You see it in the movies, but you don't expect it in real life, do you?
Kenneth Whitney's murder remains unsolved. 6 months before Kenneth Whitney was killed, private investigator Daniel Morgan was murdered in South London.
3 policemen and 2 other people have been arrested by officers investigating the murder of a private detective in London. Mr. Morgan was attacked as he left a pub in Sydenham in southeast London. He was found axed to death in the pub car park.
Daniel Morgan's family have been pressuring the Met ever since to come clean about the involvement of corrupt cops in shielding Daniel's killers.
I mean, I had to fight for 25 years before they even the word corruption even came out of their mouths, you know. Every obstacle possible was put in the way of me and my family getting to the truth of how the murder had been handled.
Despite his long campaign, the Met has never told Alistair Morgan that its own officers had reported concerns about police corruption in the area.
God almighty, he's got half the police force down there in his pocket, which seems here from this.
Alistair, what's your first thoughts on seeing them?
Horror at the extent of the alleged corruption going on down in South London there at that time. Looking at the proximity in time and space of this murder and my brother's murder, I think the whole thing is deeply, deeply worrying. There could very well be close parallels. There could very well be some of the same people involved.
Joey Pyle was jailed on drug offences. A secret Met report seen by dispatches said, "It is clear that Pyle has or had persons within the Metropolitan Police Service looking after his interests." Police intelligence also suggested that the DCS, once accused of protecting Pyle, had left the Met and had been recruited to help trace the informant who tipped off police.
If true, that would be a former police officer that's actively helping criminals identify someone who they probably wish to assault at the very least. So you're talking about potentially putting someone's, certainly their well-being, but it could be their life in danger. So yes, very, very serious.
By 2012, the Met's failure to tackle allegations of corruption in its own ranks was alarming the Home Secretary, Theresa May. She was pressing for fresh inquiries into the handling of the Stephen Lawrence and Daniel Morgan murder inquiries. But in Whitehall, there was still a reluctance to re-examine Daniel's case.
A relevant senior civil servant, whose job it was to work with the police, said, well, we can't really have an inquiry into this murder because it will become so expansive, it will be very difficult to control. And I said, well, I think it's really important that we do. We can make it a panel inquiry, it can be limited. And he said, no, you don't understand. If you start pulling at this string, you don't know where it will take you. So bad was the problem of police corruption in London in this period.
An independent panel concluded that the Met had betrayed the family of Daniel Morgan.
We believe that concealing or denying failings for the sake of an organisation's public image is dishonesty on the part of the organisation for reputational benefit. This constitutes a form of institutional corruption.
The government had insisted the Met should cooperate fully with the independent panel. Instead, there were long delays in handing over key files from the murder investigation.
There's a narrow dividing line between protecting public interest, protecting information which requires to be protected, and an organisation like the Met making itself accountable. And I think they were on the wrong side of that line a lot of time.
The Met told us that over the past few decades, it has made significant advances in how it investigates crime and in the methods in place to tackle corruption by officers. The Met says a report this year by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary found that it is not institutionally corrupt and is capable of tackling the most serious corruption. The Russell report continues to cast a long shadow. The Lawrence family are still seeking answers about the murder of their son. The killings of Daniel Morgan and Kenneth Whitney remain unsolved.
Not one single officer has been disciplined. Nobody has been called to account for anything.
You know, I'm quite appalled by it, really. You know, the police are your backbone of law and order, aren't they? Well, they should be.
Failure to acknowledge and be open and say, yes, it happened. We got it wrong. The failure to look for criminal behaviour in police officers to the extent that it needs to be looked at. It has to change.
Live coverage of England's opening Nations League match tomorrow from 4:15, followed by the living legend in his own words, Alex Ferguson, Never Give In, premieres at 7:30. Well, back to Bank Holiday Friday here on Channel 4, and like quite a lot of the country this week, we're heading to Devon and Cornwall.